Okay, so let's start from the beginning there. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks obviously to Robert in particular. I did have the pleasure of coming to Oxford a few years ago now when Robert organised a coffee conference, a very successful coffee conference. And as you said, that's how we know each other. We're both historians and we're both historians of coffee. And that means that for the first time for a long time, I'm going to say pretty much nothing about coffee because Robert will no doubt be able to tell you both A, everything about coffee, and B, everything that I get wrong. So I'm certainly avoiding that. But I wanted to show you the origins of this talk. Robert dropped me a mail and it basically said, would I talk for 20 minutes? I'll let you see exactly how he's expressed that, but on, let's say, on what's going on with Brexit or how the UK has coped with the pandemic. And if you like, my little essay plan is right there. I'm just going to whip through in hopefully 20 minutes, almost something that sort of equates to my life, which is, you know, how we went from being in the UK, a state that sort of when I was growing up was in irretrievable decline, that it suddenly seemed that we were becoming cool again, and now we seem to be conducting what many people regard as an act of massive self-harm. But before I do that, I want to go to my happy place, my good time, my last time I felt really proud to be British moment. This is the Olympics of 2012 in London. And I have to say the London Olympics sort of came at the end of a great era for Britain. And you'll remember that we had an opening ceremony, which many people may well have thought was quirky, but for us in the UK, it actually captured a lot of what we felt about ourselves, I think, and the way we brought things together. It was kind of, you know, London looking at like the global capital that we felt it was. We had an opening ceremony that celebrated all kinds of aspects of Britishness. Some of them may be weird to the outside, some you know, the quirky pop. Some like the National Health Service, you see that we had the dancing nurses with the trolley beds. The National Health Service, of course, is our social medicine service. And we were actually celebrating the contribution of immigrants and kind of the multinational, multicultural society that the UK has become. These guys were representing the first guys off the boat from the West Indies just after the war, the HMS Windrush. So this was kind of like our big moment when we thought we really were cool capitals of the world, really. And it was a huge contrast from events when I was growing up. I grew up in the 1970s, and some of you may remember coming or hearing about the UK in the 60s and 70s. And well, you know, we were known as the sick man of Europe. We were in this kind of terminal decline, it seemed, a very nice genteel decline, but we were hung up with politics, really a very class-ridden sort of set of politics, lost in kind of nostalgia. So we used to love, and still love, I feel, TV shows about the Second World War. This one is Dad's Army, perhaps the most famous of them. But, you know, we were, as your Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said, you know, the country that lost its empire and hadn't found a role. And what we had found was a lot of industrial problems. We had great conflict between unions and management. We had the period in the 70s where really at times it seemed that the unions were able to overpower the government, ending in this moment in 1979, famously the winter of discontent, when the garbage workers went on strike and no garbage got collected for a long time, as you can see on the photo on the left. So the sick man of Europe, and then of course we had the advent of Margaret Thatcher, turning around, in a sense, that view of the UK, turning around certainly a lot of the kind of political basis on which the system rested. Of course, there are the sort of, you know, the big stage moments, the Falklands, etc. The special relationship that she actually kind of made work with Ronald Reagan. We'd always claimed to have a special relationship with the States before, but our special relationship had actually seemed something we were much more clingy to than that you guys actually would really necessarily have recognized. And a lot of Thatcher's policies. So the rise of the City of London, there was a thing called Big Bang, where we reformed the way that trading was done in London. That brought in a lot of global capital from around the world, brought in a lot of global players from around the world. There was a huge cost, and the cost was really felt in those regions of traditional manufacturing. The scene there is from Orgreave, the great clash of the last miners' strike. We'd had miners' strikes in the 70s that had effectively overthrown the government. We had a miners' strike in the 80s that, to be frank, destroyed the miners and the trade unions. We also had this very weird relationship going on with Europe, whereby we were in Europe, but we kind of hummed and hawed about it. Margaret Thatcher was believed, you know, Europe was a sclerotal bureaucracy, but actually, having shouted about wanting her money back, wanting to get the amount that we paid to Europe back in grants, they actually embarked on what was a really quite profound policy, and that was creating the single market. So creating a single market in goods and services, and that was an initiative that Britain under Thatcher started, and that culminated in that 1992 Maastricht Treaty. So the Thatcher years really laid the foundation for what you might call those years of cool Britannia that came after it. I'm sure you recognise Tony Blair on the left. Many of you will recognise that on the right is, I believe, Noel Gallagher of Oasis. This sense that we'd entered a new age of kind of cultural transformation, a time when London was seen as a big sort of cultural centre of the world again. Robert and I would probably remember this as the period that food and indeed coffee took off, the first years that London became a kind of influential cultural and culinary centre. And it was a country that was, in many ways, became much more, as the Prime Minister before Blair, a guy called John Major, said he wanted it to be a country that was more at ease with itself. It seemed to be able, through basically the economic boom that had been generated by the city reforms and the single market and the growth in trade, of sort of being a society more at ease with itself, less division, less battling, and more culturally progressive. So we had sort of the abolition of some of the more aggressively homosexual legislation, what's called Section 28, had the recognition of civil partnerships. We had a sort of a sense of, if you like, New Labour under Blair being really about professional managerialism, professional politicisation. And some of that going very well, particularly in Europe, to the point where perhaps the administration got a bit ahead of itself and would do things like Blair produced the idea that we would not impose any controls on free movement, even for new countries coming into the EU. So towards the end of Blair's period in power, when we had the accession of countries such as Poland, we had a large direct migration into Britain, adding to our kind of multinational workforce. We did also continue to produce the special relationship. Blair and his colleagues also understood hard power. They understood it to the point that they aligned themselves famously with George W. Bush over Iraq. That caused a huge rift in Blair's own party. You can see the kind of protest that went on. But I would note that Blair actually won an election after Iraq, something that people tend to forget. including many of those people who now say they were opposed to it. We're also creating a remarkably good deal in Europe, it would seem. So many of the things that were introduced as ways of more integrating Europe, Britain actually opted out of. The Schengen area, which is the one that actually abolishes basically border controls, we opted out of that. The Economic and Monetary Union, famously what sets up the euro, we opted out of that. We don't have the euro. We opted out of something called the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Basically, these are controls over areas of labour law, maximum working weeks and so forth, and of various sort of police and judicial legislation. So actually, and this is why I think this whole Brexit thing becomes so weird, is we had an amazingly good deal, because actually we're benefiting from the single market, we're benefiting from all of the economic upside of Europe, but actually we'd managed to evade quite a lot of the sovereignty issues. And evade's quite an important word, because throughout this time, I would say that culturally there was a politicians were not really very keen to actually highlight how much of our success was due to Europe. Not least because culturally that didn't play well with certain groups. It was a huge problem for the Tory party. The reason that Margaret Thatcher and subsequently John Major both lost their premierships was due to conflicts within their own party over the European Union. It was something that this photo sums up. This is Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown became Prime Minister after Blair. He'd previously been the long-term Chancellor of the Exchequer, the architect of a lot of the success in that early period. And he's signing the Lisbon Treaty, from which, as we said, we had several opt-outs. So the Lisbon Treaty was signed in a wonderful ceremony in a monastery just outside of Lisbon. I think it's a 500-year-old monastery, beautifully decorated, as you can see. But this is an interesting moment, because Gordon Brown managed to avoid signing the Lisbon Treaty with everybody else present, treated it as a sort of, he didn't really want to go. He turned up 3 or 4 hours late. He said he couldn't have gone before because he had to speak to Parliament, which was at best, let's say, at best obfuscation. He could easily have got out of it. It's the way that they wanted really not to acknowledge quite how important Europe was. And that proves quite important, because Brown is faced with the impact of those 2008 financial crash, and started really to see the unraveling from that point of the very powerful economic position that we had, both as a state and as an economy. And some of Brown's reactions were to kind of reel back to fairly old type slogans. He came up with British jobs for British workers. And in a way, therefore, that Olympics moment that I showed you was kind of the last gasp. So we were already at the end of that great transformative affluent period. But it still kind of makes you think, well, why on earth would that drive you to Brexit? And I suppose we need to talk about what happened with Brexit and the campaign. So we need to start with this guy. You may know, this guy is Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage was a long-time leader of what was called UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party. And Farage was kind of a thorn in the side of the Conservative Party. His party would win big at European elections, which are basically viewed by the British voters as a free hit. We're sending members to the European Parliament. Doesn't really affect directly how people felt they were being governed. So it tends to be that protest parties would do well in them. Farage did extremely well, and the Prime Minister of the time, this guy, David Cameron, a Conservative, got worried and said that he would have a referendum on British membership, hoping basically to tone down the dangers of disharmony in his own party, his own Conservative Party. But you can see, just looking at these posters, you can see the problem right here. So Farage is doing all the things that you might expect from basically a member of certainly the far right, I suppose, blowing the immigration whistle, blowing the dog whistle. Of course, this was all supposed to be about, my goodness, Turkey will enter the EU. There was no plan for Turkey to enter the EU, and in fact, the photograph is of Syrian refugees. But Farage used this as a way of playing the immigration card. Down here we have Boris Johnson, who basically wrote himself he supposedly sat down, wrote one article about how could you defend Brexit, one article about why would you remain, decided that he preferred the language of the Brexit one and came out for Brexit. And this was the big blow, obviously, to Cameron. But again, you can see this whole thing here, let's take back control. That's a great slogan. Now, here's the guys who are fighting to remain. They're not doing much fighting. This is, even I know that's boring, and I agree with it all. But it's boring. There wasn't a sense, and it would have been very difficult to mobilize a sort of a passionate pro-European campaign, because there hadn't been a cultural level laid to do that. And really, this was what was described as Project Fear, that the Remainers were relying on Project Fear. There's a further problem with that, I think, which is that it was also very difficult for the Labour Party, because having got rid of Blair and Brown, they elected somebody, you may remember, a guy called Jeremy Corbyn, who was really elected as the anti-Blair. He was far more interested in denouncing the transition, what had been done to create New Labour. He wanted to go back to what was really a pretty left-wing party. He had very great suspicions of the European Union. And indeed, when he eventually came out and said people should vote to stay in the Union, he did it purely on the basis, and I remember this, his slogan was, you know, we're voting in to protect the NHS. Now, that really made very little sense. Okay, so what you really need to know about the referendum result is almost captured. Everything is almost captured, I think, in these two charts, chart and map. Demographically, you see almost exactly this goes generation after generation. The older people are, the more they voted out. The midpoint is here. So basically, people under 45, 18 to 45 voters voted overwhelmingly to stay. Above 45, they voted increasingly to leave, producing the result that was overall 48 to stay, 52 to leave. So it's a very, very demographic thing. It's that nostalgia for that old stuff, going back to that, a big division in society and values. The second thing is, of course, to look at it on a map. And what you notice here is really what had been happening in Britain. These areas here, this is London around here. This area is our most affluent area, without doubt. It's the area that got the benefit from all of those boom years. It's the areas that was doing well. We have two other notable areas of Remain. One is here. This is Scotland, of course, and Scotland, I think, voted by about 62% to Remain, or slightly less than that, and Northern Ireland, which voted largely to Remain. And obviously part of that has to do with the special issues relating to Ireland and Northern Ireland. The Scots, a lot to do also with the sense, I think, that they wanted to, they didn't recognise themselves in the Brexit campaign as what they reconciled themselves in is the notion of being an independent state that could operate within a Europe. So what happened after that? Well, the aftermath is that several of the people on the picture in the left caused problems. This lady, Theresa May, became Prime Minister after Cameron stepped down. Here on the left is Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn. Behind them, various previous Prime Ministers, Brown, Blair, Brown Major. Theresa May, I think, felt it was her duty to do this job. She won a Conservative election to become leader. She had not been that enthusiastic, but had been a Remainer. She saw the vote and interpreted the vote as being all about the freedom of movement and sovereignty. And so straight away ruled out doing any kind of deal that retained any of the features or the key elements of the European Union: no single market, no customs union, no sort of affiliate status. She got completely caught by her own party because she didn't know how to handle that issue about what do you do about Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has a land border with the Republic. The land border has been, as you know, and we don't really have time to do all of that here, at the heart of the issue between Ireland and the UK. And in a way, the Good Friday Agreement and membership of the EU almost helped resolve that thing by meaning that there was free movement across that border. May, sense of duty, not a very good politician, called an election she didn't need to call because she thought everyone would vote for her, because why would they vote for Corbyn? Answer: because she gave them nothing to vote for and nobody wanted an election. So she ended up in a minority government, leaving her in the hands of the Ulster Unionists, the very hardline Northern Ireland Loyalist Party, and having to give them lots and lots of money and lots of sort of concessions just to keep her government going. For the other Brexiteers, notably our friend Mr. Johnson over there, the negotiations were never really about the best outcome. For them, they were about the best cultural sovereignty narrative. So they see things as much more, I think, in terms of how will this deal look? How does it sound in terms of our Britishness and independence than is it a good deal? So, for example, we've expended an enormous amount of time on negotiating a fisheries deal, which I think is about 0.1% of our economy. Far more time and far more effort has been put into that than has been put into negotiating a deal about the financial sector, which is the dominant sector in the UK economy and is losing many of its privileges in Europe at the moment. The importance of taking that hard line, the dithering of May, led to her overthrow and the rehabilitation of Boris and his bringing him in. And Boris, sorry. Okay, somebody was just terrified by Boris. Don't worry, I'm not going to take much longer. Boris, to me, you know, what are his advantages? Well, his advantages are that he plays the upper class buffoon brilliantly. He plays the I'm the guy you could have a beer with. I'd be great to, you know, to have fun with. He does that classic wing and a prayer and a joke. It's great on adversarial politics and the debating society. He's very, very light on ideological baggage, ideological ideas, any ideas. He's only really strong on ambition. It's a hugely divisive figure out in Scotland, out in Ireland, precisely because he represents everything about the kind of British sort of establishment that they don't like. But he is able to win an election because by then Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, has been kind of outed, as it were. It's become clear that he has no, you know, that he is this sort of far left candidate, that he is really unelectable. And he also has no traction amongst the traditional Labour supporters, because whereas those traditional Labour supporters, the old industrial working class, the disadvantaged areas, are you know, solid sort of patriotic type people, a bit like, I guess, the guys in your Rust Belt. He's very much the product of the kind of London intelligentsia wing of the party, much more the sort of, you know, the trendy socialist wing. So that, I'm afraid, results in Boris's election. It results in the deal that we now have had negotiated. It results in the disaster of the fact that a man who does not do detail and really relies on others for his ideas is supposed to be leading us through a pandemic, and this is actually a pretty tame version of his leadership style. He's dithered about everything. Consequently, he dithered about all of the lockdowns, he dithered about masks, he dithered about, you name it, he's dithered about it. He often has changed his mind from one day to another. And the result is we have the highest per capita death rate to date in the pandemic of any major country, unless you include Belgium, which seems to be a particular case. His emblematic of this is the loyalty to this guy. This guy is Dominic Cummings, who was the sort of the eminence grise of the Brexit campaign, who Johnson really relied on to do his thinking. Cummings is the ultimate outsider, a typical guy who Robert will probably have met, this kind of guy. He's a history graduate, so of course he hates all arts and humanities and thinks that everything should be invested in STEM science. Cummings helped draft the legislation which was all about the restrictions on movement during the pandemic, and then promptly broke all of them by driving pretty much from one end of England to the other, despite believing that he, his wife and child had the virus, so that they could go and be near his parents when they locked down. So he pretty much broke every rule. Rather than get rid of him, he was given an awful long time by Johnson to ultimately even hold a press conference in the Downing Street garden to say why he'd done this and why this was not a problem. And Johnson just said, well, now we're going to move on. And I can tell you that the public always identify that moment as the weakness of Johnson's leadership to date. So where are we left? Eventually Cummings has gone. Why did he go? Well, Johnson's girlfriend fell out with him. I'm sorry to put it bluntly, but that's really the truth. Johnson's girlfriend is herself a party advisor, and she brought in another of her friends, and this is really how our administration works, and they ultimately convinced Johnson that he'd been saying nasty things about Johnson's girlfriend, so he had to go. So break pandemic laws is fine, but be nasty about girlfriend, no. Where does that leave us? Well, it left us with Brexit, and it leaves us with a kind of a really weird situation. Here's our border. Sorry, here are our borders. Sorry, one of them's in the sea. This is the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but it's still open. This is the actual customs border, which separates UK mainland from Northern Ireland, but we're part of the same state. This is a mess, to be blunt, and a lot of things are already going wrong with it. There are some very weird things because, of course, a lot of what is shipped to Northern Ireland actually goes pretty much out from here to there and then has to go up there. Well, that creates all kinds of issues. So this is what creates a lot of issues around Northern Ireland. Then we have the case of Scotland. Scotland is run by the Scottish Nationalist Party, of whom this lady here, Nicola Sturgeon, is the leader. They dominate the Scottish devolved assembly, one of the things that was brought in during the sort of the Cool Britannia era. They want full independence for the country. There was a referendum some time ago which was lost. They now want another independence referendum, and the motive for that referendum is Brexit. And the likelihood is they will win that referendum if it were held, partly for Brexit, partly for, frankly, the disregard with which Johnson is held and the sense that Scotland has actually done better in the pandemic. Is this economically sustainable? It's a cultural argument once again. But what it does mean, to be blunt, is also it's very unlikely, I think, that Labour can really get back into power until that issue is resolved, because it's difficult to see how Labour gets elected to government without winning some seats in Scotland. And right now, all of those seats are going to go to the Scottish nationalists. It's also difficult to not think that what will happen in Scotland is that we'll have a version of Catalonia. That's to say that the SNP will organise a referendum which is not granted official status by the UK government. They will win that referendum, and then there will be, in effect, a sort of a state that wishes to withdraw from the Union, but is not able formally to do so. Where will we go in terms of with the European Union? We have a very difficult issue at the moment. We have all the issues around the border, but we have actually, I mean, the EU have managed to make this even worse for themselves by, in the sort of the recent battles on the pandemic. So there is a protocol about how this border operates, which is supposed to be virtually unbreakable, but has an emergency clause in it. It's been in operation, the border, now for about a month. The British government have threatened to break that protocol, and the EU threatened to break that protocol. The EU threatened to do that last week in order to secure supplies of the vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they did that without even consulting the government of Ireland, and had to withdraw it 3 hours later. We have an ongoing battle about the fact that EU ambassadors are not being granted ambassador status to the United Kingdom, even though they are granted ambassador status, so diplomatic rights, etc., everywhere else in the world, including in the States, by the way. We're having this vaccine battle, which goes beyond trying to secure supplies, where there seem to be various supply issues, to actually dissing each other's vaccines. So the French Prime Minister is saying that the Oxford vaccine is no good. The British are saying, well, look how much better we are than Europe because we've rolled out all of this vaccine, ignoring the fact that actually, A, the vaccine was developed in Europe, and B, the fact that actually we also have the worst death rate in Europe. So all of this is pretty frightening, and my fear is that we are edging back towards those 1970s period, that we will go into some kind of gradual genteel decline, not, you know, not like fall off a cliff, but just year by year, worse and worse, and that will be exacerbated by the very high bill that we're all going to have to pay for the pandemic. The only hope I think that we have is that we get some new administrations, both frankly in the UK and in Europe, that actually realise that we are better off doing some straightforward trade deals that, while not changing the kind of sovereignty issues that we have, at least make it possible for us to go forward. So with that happy scenario, I'll stop there, and I hope I haven't taken too many more than the 20 minutes. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you for your talk. How about some questions? Anybody have any questions?